May 2nd, 1957, Manhattan, New York City, 10:55 in the evening. The lobby of the majestic apartments on Central Park West is quiet. Marble floors, polished brass fixtures. The kind of building that suggests wealth without announcing it, where powerful men live without displaying their power. A doorman stands at his post. A few residents pass through. The building breathes the ordinary rhythms of a Tuesday night. Then a car slows outside. A heavy-set man steps out. He is not hurrying. He does not look nervous. He adjusts the brim of his hat and walks toward the entrance with the measured confidence of a man who believes he belongs anywhere he chooses to stand. His name will later become known, but in this moment he is simply a figure in the shadows, moving with purpose through the quiet lobby toward the elevator bank. Moments later, the front door opens again. Frank Costello enters the building. Frank Costello is 65 years old. He is wearing a charcoal suit, a fedora, and carries himself with the unhurried dignity of a man who has spent 40 years being the most important person in every room he enters. He is not a large man. He was never a large man. His power was never physical. It resided in his voice, his connections, his unmatched ability to make men feel that cooperating with him was in their own best interest. He is the acting boss of what law enforcement would eventually call the Genovese crime family. He is, by any serious measure, one of the most powerful men in the United States, not elected, not appointed, not publicly known, but powerful in ways that elected officials could only dream of. He nods to the doorman and moves toward the elevator. Behind him, footsteps, measured, deliberate. The man who had been waiting turns. Costello does not hear what is said. He may not even have time to register what is happening. A single gunshot pierces the lobby. The bullet grazes the right side of Costello's skull and exits without penetrating the brain. Frank Costello crumples. Blood appears. The shooter walks calmly out of the building, disappears into the Manhattan night, and is gone before anyone fully understands what has just occurred. The doorman stands frozen. Other residents scatter. Costello, against all odds, is alive. In any other city, in any other world, this would be the end of a story. A man survives an assassination attempt. Law enforcement investigates. The perpetrator is identified and prosecuted. But this is not any other world. This is the New York Mafia in 1957. And what happened next, what Costello chose to do with his survival, and the man who ordered that bullet chose to do with the power Costello left behind, reveals everything about how the underworld truly operates. It reveals the mechanics of betrayal, the architecture of ambition, the way power moves between men who have spent their lives accumulating it and will spend their final years watching it dissolve. To understand the significance of that gunshot, you must understand two men. You must understand how they rose together, how they grew apart, and how one of them decided that the other man's continued existence was an obstacle he could no longer tolerate. You must understand that the tension between Frank Costello and Vito Genovese was not a sudden eruption of violence between strangers. It was the slow culmination of years of ambition, resentment, and diverging visions for what organized crime in America should be. And you must understand that in the Mafia, loyalty is the currency of survival, until the moment it is not. Their story begins long before that May evening. It begins in poverty, in ambition, in the immigrant neighborhoods of New York, where two men decided that the rules of legitimate society did not apply to them, and that power, real power, was available to those with the discipline and ruthlessness to take it. Because in the Mafia, power is never given, it is taken. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Francesco Castilla was born on January 26, 1891, in the Calabria region of southern Italy. He was 4 years old when his family immigrated to East Harlem in New York City, one of hundreds of thousands of Italian families who arrived in America during that era, carrying nothing but the determination to survive. East Harlem in the 1890s was not a place of opportunity. It was a place of survival. Poverty was absolute. Employment was scarce. The institutions of American democracy, education, legal employment, political representation were largely inaccessible to immigrants who did not speak English and were viewed with suspicion by the established population. Young Francesco, who would eventually become known as Frank Costello, watched the world around him and made a calculation that countless young men in similar circumstances have made throughout history. Legitimate paths were closed, but there were other paths. By his early 20s, Costello was involved in petty crime, robberies, gambling, various street-level operations. He was arrested twice, served time in prison, and emerged from these early experiences with a crucial insight. Violence was a limited instrument. Men who relied primarily on violence died violently or spent their lives imprisoned. The men who lasted, the men who accumulated real power, were those who understood that organization, diplomacy, and strategic corruption were more effective than intimidation. This insight would define Costello's entire career. During Prohibition, Costello built a bootlegging empire in alliance with major figures including Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano, and Meyer Lansky. But where others used their wealth to display status, Costello invested his in something more valuable: political relationships. He cultivated connections with Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that controlled New York City politics for generations. He built relationships with judges, politicians, police officials, and union leaders. He became the man you called when you needed something done in New York City that required navigating the complex intersection of power and politics. By the 1940s, Frank Costello had earned the title that perfectly captured his unique position in the criminal hierarchy: the Prime Minister of the Underworld. This was not a title of brute force. It was a title of influence. Costello did not rule through fear in the traditional sense. He ruled through leverage, through the accumulated weight of relationships, favors, and information that made him indispensable to everyone who mattered. He was known to take meetings with legitimate businessmen, politicians, and civic leaders. He was photographed at charity events and social gatherings. He lived well, but not ostentatiously. He understood that visibility was a form of vulnerability, and he calibrated his public presence carefully. His leadership style within the Luciano family — he served as acting boss after Luciano's imprisonment — was fundamentally diplomatic. He preferred negotiation to violence. He believed that conflict was expensive, unpredictable, and ultimately destructive to the financial interests that organized crime existed to serve. He would sit across from men he despised and find acceptable compromises because he understood that an agreement today protected tomorrow's profits. This was not weakness, it was sophistication. But it was a sophistication that others would eventually mistake for softness. Vito Genovese, ambition without patience. Vito Genovese was born on November 27, 1897, in a small village near Naples, Italy. Like Costello, he came to America as a child, arriving in New York City in 1913 at the age of 15. But where Costello found his path through politics and diplomacy, Genovese found his through something more direct: violence. From the beginning of his criminal career, Genovese demonstrated a willingness to use extreme violence that separated him from more cautious contemporaries. He committed his first murder, allegedly, in the early 1920s, a killing that established his reputation as a man of decisive and lethal action. He rose through the criminal ranks in New York during Prohibition, becoming a significant figure in the Luciano organization. By the early 1930s, Genovese was one of Luciano's most trusted lieutenants. He was ambitious, capable, and absolutely without sentimentality. He saw power as something to be seized rather than cultivated, and he pursued it with an urgency that sometimes bordered on recklessness. In 1934, Genovese ordered the murder of a man named Ferdinand Boccia, a crime that would eventually force him to flee the country. In 1937, as murder charges were being prepared for him, Genovese left for Italy. He took with him considerable wealth and an unwavering belief that he would return. What followed was one of the more extraordinary chapters in the history of organized crime. In Italy, Genovese ingratiated himself with the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini. He made financial contributions to the movement, curried favor with senior officials, and even had a political rival murdered to demonstrate his usefulness to the regime. When World War II ended and Genovese's patron had been executed by partisans, Genovese once again demonstrated his remarkable adaptability. He became useful to American military authorities, serving as a translator and advisor as the Allied forces occupied southern Italy. He worked both sides with equal facility, using his position to continue criminal operations even under military governance. In 1945, the murder charge that had driven him from America collapsed when the primary witness against him died under suspicious circumstances in a New York jail cell. Vito Genovese returned to the United States. He had been gone for nearly a decade. The criminal world he returned to had changed significantly. Lucky Luciano had been deported to Italy. Frank Costello had used the intervening years to consolidate his influence and become the dominant figure in the family's leadership. The organization that Genovese had helped build now ran smoothly under different management, and Genovese wanted it back. The tension built.
Commission relationships to seek retribution and reaffirm his authority, he stepped down. He retired. He met with the appropriate parties, acknowledged that he was stepping back from active leadership of the family, and withdrew. He would live out the remainder of his life in relative comfort, died in 1973 at age 82, and was largely left alone by Genovese's administration. Why did a man of Costello's power and influence simply walk away? The answer reveals something essential about how the Mafia actually operated, as opposed to how it appears in popular mythology. Costello's power had always resided in relationships, diplomacy, and the willingness of other powerful men to support him. The assassination attempt demonstrated that this support had either eroded or had been deliberately neutralized by Genovese's machinations. To fight back effectively, Costello would have needed allies who were willing to engage in a direct conflict with Genovese. Such a conflict would mean violence, disruption, and potential exposure to law enforcement at a moment when the FBI was beginning to pay serious attention. His allies, the same diplomats and cautious operators who had respected his approach for years, were not men who relished war. Costello weighed the cost of fighting against the cost of walking away. He chose to live. Vito Genovese assumed control of the family that would permanently bear his name. He had achieved what he had worked toward for over a decade. The man who had stood in his way had stepped aside. The organization was his. He had what he wanted. And almost immediately, it began to cost him everything. Power obtained through betrayal carries with it a particular instability. The methods used to seize it signal to every other ambitious man in the organization what is possible and what is permissible. A boss who rose by moving against his predecessor creates a precedent and a vulnerability that cannot be easily managed. Vito Genovese understood this intellectually. Whether he fully internalized it is another question.
His reign at the top of the family began with confidence. He moved aggressively to consolidate control, rewarding those who had supported his rise and sending clear signals about what awaited those who questioned his authority. He reimposed the kind of firm, hierarchical discipline that he believed Costello's diplomatic approach had allowed to weaken. But within months of taking power, events were already moving against him in ways that not even his considerable cunning could contain. In October 1957, just 5 months after the Costello shooting, something happened that would change the trajectory of American organized crime forever and permanently damage the organization Genovese had just fought so hard to lead. The Apalachin meeting. On November 14, 1957, over 60 of the most senior members of La Cosa Nostra gathered at the estate of Joseph Barbara in Apalachin, a small town in upstate New York. The purpose of the meeting was to address several pressing matters within the National Commission, including the formal recognition of Genovese's new authority, discussions about narcotics policy, and the distribution of territories following the recent murder of Albert Anastasia, who had been killed just weeks earlier. A local state police sergeant named Edgar Crosswell had become suspicious of the unusual volume of expensive automobiles converging on the Barbara estate. He organized a roadblock. When delegates at the meeting spotted the police presence, panic ensued. Senior Mafia figures, men of enormous power and dignity, fled through the woods and fields surrounding the estate, abandoning their vehicles, their dignity, and their most closely guarded secret. Dozens were detained. Their identities were recorded. The national press covered the story with breathless fascination. The Apalachin disaster accomplished what decades of law enforcement effort had failed to achieve. It provided irrefutable public proof that a national organized crime existed in the United States, that it held formal meetings, and that its leadership included men from cities across the country. J. Edgar Hoover, who had publicly maintained that no such organization existed, could no longer sustain that fiction. The FBI was compelled to begin taking organized crime seriously. For Genovese personally, Apalachin was catastrophic. He had organized the meeting. His ascension to power was one of the primary items on the agenda. His ambition, the very drive that had placed him at the center of these events, had created the occasion for the most significant law enforcement exposure in the history of American organized crime. Other bosses noticed, and they had already been watching Genovese with the particular wariness that powerful men reserve for those they recognize as threats. Genovese's aggressive approach, his willingness to move against Costello, his orchestration of Anastasia's murder, his imperious style of leadership, these had generated resentment within the commission. Bosses who had tolerated his ambition when it served their interests now viewed him as a liability. What followed was, by most historical accounts, a conspiracy of the very kind that Genovese had employed to take power. Senior figures within the commission, believing that Genovese had become dangerously unstable and threatened the organization's security, allegedly arranged for an informant to provide law enforcement with the evidence needed to remove him. In 1958, Genovese was indicted on federal narcotics charges. The case rested primarily on the testimony of a drug dealer named Nelson Cantelops, who claimed that Genovese had been involved in narcotics distribution. Genovese protested that the charges were fabricated. He was likely correct that powerful forces within the organization had engineered his vulnerability, but the evidence, real or manufactured, was sufficient. In 1959, Vito Genovese was convicted of conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was 61 years old. He would never leave prison as a free man. From his cell in the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, Genovese continued to exert what influence he could. He sent messages through intermediaries. He attempted to maintain his authority over the family. He conducted himself with the bearing of a man who believed his imprisonment was temporary and his return to power inevitable. But prisons, particularly for aging men managing serious health conditions, have a way of collapsing those expectations. Genovese's health deteriorated. His direct influence over events diminished as the men he had trusted most either died, were themselves imprisoned, or gradually transferred their loyalties to whoever could provide more immediate protection and benefit. In February 14, 1969, Vito Genovese died of heart failure in the Prison Medical Center at Springfield, Missouri. He was 71 years old. The family he had schemed and murdered to lead survived him by decades, eventually producing some of the most consequential figures in American organized crime history. But it did so under new leadership, with new priorities, shaped by events and forces that Genovese had set in motion but could not control. He died in prison. The man he had tried to kill died in his own bed, 14 years later, at the age of 82. The symmetry is not accidental. It reflects something fundamental about the world both men inhabited. Frank Costello's power had been built on relationships, patience, and the systematic cultivation of goodwill. When it was challenged, he chose to preserve himself rather than destroy what remained of his influence in a futile conflict. He made peace with diminishment and lived. Vito Genovese's power had been built on ambition, pressure, and the elimination of obstacles. When he seized the pinnacle he had worked toward for decades, he found it surrounded by enemies he had created, watched by a government he had provoked, and undermined by colleagues who had learned from his own methods. He took power by force. He lost it the same way, not by a bullet, but to the accumulated consequences of every decision he had made in its pursuit. This is the enduring lesson of the Genovese-Costello story, not a lesson about organized crime specifically, but about the nature of power itself. Power that is built on betrayal is inherently unstable. It signals to every ambitious subordinate what methods are acceptable and what protections are ultimately absent. It creates a culture of suspicion where loyalty cannot be trusted because loyalty was the first thing sacrificed on the way to the top. Costello understood this. His diplomatic approach was not simply his personal preference, it was a recognition that sustainable power requires the genuine cooperation of those who submit to it. When cooperation becomes impossible to maintain, the wise course is withdrawal rather than escalation. Genovese never understood it, or understood it too late. The New York Mafia would continue for decades after both men were gone. New bosses would rise, new betrayals would occur, new empires would be built and broken. The patterns that defined the Costello-Genovese conflict would repeat themselves with different names and different circumstances, because the patterns were not accidental. They were intrinsic to the structure of an organization built on silence, fear, and the perpetual competition for authority. Vito Genovese wanted everything. He got it, and it destroyed him. Frank Costello wanted survival. He chose it, and it saved him. In the Mafia, as in the wider world, the distinction between those two desires is often the distance between a long life and a prison cell. That, in the end, is the true legacy of the bullet that grazed Frank Costello's skull on a quiet Manhattan evening in May of 1957. Not the violence of it, not the ambition behind it, but the irony that followed, patient, inevitable, and absolute.